Hey, well, good morning. It is good to be here. I was told before I even got here that the game was starting at 11, but God forbid that we put our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ above an Illinois game. There's room at the altar for those of you, Jim, and while we're at it, we'll just like to invite any of the Chief fans to come, and we'll excise that demon as well. Get that out of the way right now. I mean, shame on you. And there's room also here for Chiefs fans and their officiating crew right here to ask for forgiveness for that debacle last night. Anyway, we are starting a new year. We've been in this new series called Onward, and really just kind of focusing on, when you start a new year, it's always exciting. You look forward and try to do some things differently. I don't know if anybody's done anything differently yet to the new year, but we're trying to kind of look beyond even just individually, but just collectively as a church. As your pastor, I just wanted to kind of share with you some things that we've got things planning, where things are in the work. I'm excited about what God is doing already around this place, and Jim shared some of that with Life Change and some of the stories that Jim and I get to hear. Every time I say that, Jim and I, it's like, I don't know if anybody's a Gemini here, but anyway, we're just excited. I'm just excited about what God has. I believe that God has, for some reason, I feel like God has something special in store for our church this year, that He is doing stuff in people's lives, and that we're experiencing life change. People are experiencing life change, which is what we are after. We want to be missional, compassionate, and authentic, but we want to be those things so that people can experience true life change, and that your life looks differently from the inside out. And I just believe that God is doing that. That we're trying to stay kingdom-minded, and that's something I've talked about before. But it's easy to get focused on the lower story, which is part of the story that we live in here on earth. But there's a much bigger story that's taking place and has been since creation, and it's kingdom-mindedness. And I know I say that and you hear that, but I don't know if you really truly understand what it means to be kingdom-minded. When you are kingdom-minded, you are focused on what God is doing in His kingdom. It's so much greater than what is happening in the American political scene or whatever we see on our news and on social media. And, it's bigger than TikTok getting banned. I'm heartbroken about that. But anyway, it's just bigger than that. So we're trying to stay kingdom-minded and really want to talk a little bit about that. So we've been focusing on really the story of God and His people, the Israelites. And so we the last several weeks, we've been talking about this journey that the Israelites have taken in history. You can read about it in Genesis and Exodus and Numbers, and throughout most of the Old Testament, it's God teaching His people how to love Him and trust Him and how to lean into Him. And so week one, we talked about the fact that these Israelites had a really short memory. He rescued them from Egypt, 300 years of slavery. They walked across the Red Sea on dry ground, and then just two or 3 days later, they were complaining and belly aching about something and not having to eat or drink. And so we've been talking about that, and I want to continue with that. But just really question to start off, does anybody here know a chronic complainer? There was a picture or an image of somebody that popped into your mind, wasn't there, when I said that? You immediately knew who these people are. And my question is, are you a bellyacher? Are you somebody that just chronically and constantly complains? Anybody? Do you ever see it? Do you know people like that? Come on, I know you do. We all know those people that are just chronic bellyaches. Are you ever just sick of them? Come on. And I know I'm probably one of them. But anyway, I felt bad, the whole snowstorm. For some reason or another, I just feel horrible. My wife's an educator, but I feel sorry for our superintendents and directors of our school, because there is no possibly way they're going to get the right answer. Have you ever noticed that? And then everybody who has never been a school administrator knows exactly how it should happen, right? And they post it on Facebook. I mean, they cancel school. People are like, well, I canceled school. When I was a kid, I walked barefoot. We went to school. I didn't care how cold it was, and they post that on Facebook, and everybody jumps on, yeah, we were tougher than these kids today, and then they don't cancel school. And what are we doing? We're risking our kids' lives. It's just no matter what they do, People just freak out, and they are chronic. There are people in this life that I feel sorry for them. They're so negative. Like, there are some people that are just to be around them, it sucks the life out of you. Do you know what I mean? Like, it just, like, come on, is there anything that you are not upset about? Like, anything at all in life. There's always somebody somewhere that has been out of shape and belly aching. And I think we all do it to an extent. I've caught myself even this week. I had this message, ready, and I'm like, oh, I'm like one of those people. I'm one of them, especially when I'm driving and some of you are in front of me. That is a struggle for me. We went to Marion last night, and I spoke to a lot of people on I-57 yesterday. It's really, I just want to look at this and how we can move past being part of the problem and be part of the solution. Have you ever noticed that? Don't you ever want to do that? And I Googled actually, why do people complain? It was interesting. This is what it said. The act of complaining, this is interesting, comes from the need to express frustration. We feel this need. We feel frustrated. We feel bent out of shape over something that didn't go our way, or the way we think it should have gone, or the way we would do it, or the way I think it should happen. And we feel this need to express that frustration. And now that we live in the culture that we live in, we have social media, so people feel compelled to go out and make a post about how something ticked them off. And then they just, I think they just sit and wait for people to jump on and then go, oh yeah, me too, you're right. Bunch of belly achers. Like, come on. And so it goes on. It says, or even to look for sympathy. We're looking for sympathy. Complaining, I'm just reading what Google said. Complaining too frequently, however, can impact your mood and potentially damage your relationships. If you think you're complaining too much, or if you've been told that you are, it might be time to make a change. And I just found that interesting that Google said that. So I got to looking, and I got a reading in this story in history, and here's what it is. Here's what complaining does. Complaining reflects a lack of faith and gratitude. When you complain, especially if we are believers and followers of Jesus Christ, or claim to be, complaining, all that does is it just reflects a lack of faith or gratitude. And we've been following this story of the Israelites and God's chosen people. And we've been, they had problems with their long-term memory. They had problems with trust. They couldn't remember what God had already done for them. They couldn't trust God to do anything to lead them into the promised land. And I'm telling you what, if there was an Olympic event of complaining, the Israelites would be gold medalists. Like, they would have been absolute gold medalists. They were phenomenal at complaining and belly aching. Let me just read you. Here it is. Exodus chapter 15, it says this, 15:24. The Israelites often grumbled against Moses and God, demonstrating, and here's scripture proof that they're demonstrating lack of trust. In verse 24, it says this, then the people complained and turned to Moses. What are we going to drink? They demanded. Last week, we saw, in this message, we saw, if you are just catching up, they got to this promised land that God had promised them. They looked over, they sent 12 spies into the land of Canaan. 10 of them came back and said, yeah, it's awesome, but there's no way we're going to do it. And they had completely forgotten everything that God had done for them up to that point, and they just felt like they couldn't do it, and they were right. They couldn't do it on their own. They could only do it with God. And so people immediately began to complain and freak out when that happened. Immediately turned on their leadership. They immediately turned on Moses and said, what have you done? Why have you let us out here? We wish we were back in Egypt. At least we would be able to die and eat something there. And they just completely, let me just go on. Numbers chapter 14. The whole community began weeping out loud, and they cried all night. What a bunch of babies. You ever just want to say that to people? Like sometimes I just want to respond on Facebook and go, y'all are a bunch of babies. I just, but here's the thing. We're the same way. These people were crying and weeping out loud. They cried all night. Let me go on. This is Numbers chapter 14, verse 2. The voices rose in a great chorus. It was a great chorus of complaining. Whoa! And protest against Moses and Aaron. They were harmonizing in complaints. If only we had died in Egypt, or even here in the wilderness, they, what? Complained. They were good at it. Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? Have you ever reached a situation in your life? It was interesting. I was talking to my brother yesterday, and somebody reached out to him and had a question for him. He's got some guys that go to his house, a small group of guys. It was one of the guys that reached out and said, and his question was, why would God, I've only prayed for one thing particularly in my wife, and he's taken that away, and why would God do that? When something doesn't go our way, or we haven't prayed, we've prayed about something and the opposite happens, we immediately like, well, why would God do that? That's what these people were doing. Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? They plotted among themselves, let's choose a new leader and go back to Egypt. They were ready to ditch Moses and Aaron, who had rescued them from 300 years of slavery, led them across the Red Sea, had provided water and manna, and they just wanted to complain. The reason the Israelites spent so long in the wilderness is because their faith was not very strong, and they struggled again and again, worshiping golden calves instead of God, complaining about what God had not provided, rebelling against Moses and Aaron, and worshiping pagan gods. That was the plight of these Israelites. So, here's my point. I think one of the greatest hindrances for us moving onward, either personally in our individual lives, in our families, or collectively as a body of believers in a church, one of the greatest hindrances will be our belly aching and not trusting God. No church is immune. I mean, and I'm not even saying there's not things to complain about. I'm sure there is. There are. And sometimes complaints, when they're addressed properly, they can lead to positive results. But I think the attitude in which our complaints are addressed makes a difference. There will always be something to complain about. And cultivating gratitude helps us focus on God's blessing rather than the challenges. We can choose to have an attitude of gratitude, or we can and work together to find solutions, or we can sit around in our circles and we can grumble and complain like the Israelites did. And it hindered them from being able to move forward. They missed out on what God had for them because they couldn't get their head wrapped around what God was doing in the moment and what he was capable of doing. And here's the thing. This year, I want to work myself to be more positive. Even in the face of difficulty, I want to be the kind of person that says, you know what? That didn't go exactly how I wanted it to go. But I'm not going to complain. I'm going to trust God. I'm going to trust that he knows what's going on. I'm going to trust to put him first. And I'm going to trust to keep my belly aching to myself, except when I'm driving. I read some tips, Googled some tips. Here's some tips on tips to stop complaining. Practice gratitude for what you have. Focus on solutions instead of problems. Affirm what is going right. Take a look at your situation and go, well, yeah, this is bad and this is bad, but this is going good and this is going good. Limit your exposure to negative. I think sometimes we need to get off Facebook. like sometimes she'll say, hey, have you seen this? And I'm like, no, and I'm grateful. I'm glad I haven't seen it. There may be some people that you need to cut out of your life because they are constantly negative. There may be some people that you're like, you know what? I can't be around you anymore because you are bringing me down. Give yourself a limit for complaining. We're all going to do it, but there needs to be a limit. There needs to be, listen, I don't like this. I hate the way this went and blah, 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 and I would have done it this way, but here's the deal. I'm over it right now. I'm gonna put a deadline on my complaining, and I'm going to stop. Daily prayer and Bible time. I think the more time we spend praying and the more time we spend in a relationship with Jesus Christ and diving into his word, the less you'll have to complain about, I promise. It's like Shane said, we take so much for granted. He is a good, good Father. And we need to be reminded of it sometimes. Practice some empathy. There's a good one. You ever try to put yourself in somebody else's shoes? Maybe we should try that more often. And then the last one was just find joy in your life and soak in it. I like that one. These people, these Israelites just were so caught up, and they were so caught up, and all they could see was the bad. Despite all that God had done to them, for them, and through them up to that point. You ever dealt with disappointment? Ever have like a moment in your life when it was you were super disappointed? I've had a couple. I remember one time. It's a different era. We grew up in an era was very strict, and it was just the way culture was and the way church was at that time. There were a lot of things that we could not do as kids, and one of those things was to swim at the city pool. And some of you are like, "What?" I'm like, "Yeah, I know. That's the way I grew up." But we just couldn't swim at the city pool because there were girls at the city pool, and we could not be there swimming with girls. It was just part of the deal. And so one of the times, but we loved to swim. My brothers and I loved to swim. And one time Mom would put us in the truck and take us to the lake, and we'd swim to the lake. And we didn't care, we just loved to swim. And I remember one time we went, and we couldn't find a spot that was suitable enough to swim. So we just went, we were so excited we were going to go swim. And then Mom and Dad couldn't find a spot that was suitable. So we just drove around the lake. We saw the water, just couldn't get in the water. So we ended up coming all the way back home, no swimming that day. I was so disappointed as a kid. I was heartbroken. I remember, has anybody ever had a boat? Everybody ever own a boat? Like, yeah. My boating experience is brutal. Like, it's just, I don't know, I just got crappy boats. I remember we loaded a similar experience for my kids. I grew up, I remember that experience as a kid. I was like, that's never going to happen to my kids. I got my kids up. We loaded up the boat. We're going to the lake. You ever have that experience as a boat owner? You back down the ramp and you go to hit the key and it's like, I was like, okay, kids, back in the car. We're going back home. It was just brutal. It was just, kids were like, oh, are you kidding, Dad? It's like, sorry, dead battery. We're going back home. No lake day today. And so it's just dealing with disappointment is just rough, isn't it? Even as a kid, you ever get this guilt trip as a kid when you do something and your parents say, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. It makes you feel about 3 feet tall. Your parents, you're like, well, thanks a lot. I'd rather you just be mad. Can I just get a spanking instead of that? That's the way it was. But dealing with disappointment is rough. It's, your kids are all different. Some of them you can beat them and they just don't care. And then you have that other kid that you look at them the wrong way and then they're like, I'm sorry, It's just one of those kids. It's just weird. But I was like, I hated to be disappointed, and I hated disappointment as a kid. But here's the thing. Disappointing is the worst feeling, but we've all faced it, and we're all going to face it again. There are going to be moments in your life when things don't go the way you wanted them to go, and you're going to be disappointed. So the question is, how do you deal with that? How do we learn to deal, especially as believers and followers of Jesus Christ, who have all the hope and trust, or at least we say we do, in Jesus, our Savior? How do we learn to deal with that disappointment? The Israelites had that same thing happen. I believe this. Zig Ziglar had a quote. It says this: disappointment is a temporary detour on the road to success. If we're going to go onward as a church and do amazing things here, and even in your life this year in 2025, if you have plans, let me just tell you something. There are going to be some things that happen this year that are going to disappoint you. Let me just tell you, that may be me as your pastor. I may be your disappointment, and I'm sorry ahead of time, but I'm just a heads up. It may happen. So how do we deal with it? And so I want to look at this story a little bit closer. Have you ever noticed, too, like when you're faced with consequences, our attitude changes? Let me give you an example. Like you tell your kid to clean the room, and you come back an hour later, they haven't cleaned the room. You ever done that? All parents have experienced that. You've experienced that as a kid, But then the next time you go, you're like, if you don't clean your room, I'm taking your PlayStation. And they're like, oh, okay. And then you come back and still nothing, And then all of a sudden you take their PlayStation, and then they're like, no, wait. Wait. Let me tell you something. Thank you. Some of you got that. Let me tell you something. I will do it. It's exactly what happened in this story. Let's read it. They get to the edge of the promised land. They send these 12 people in. 10 of them come back and go, yeah, it's awesome. Caleb and Joshua are like, I think we can do this. Let's go. The other 10 are like, there's no way, man. And so they all start belly aching. They all start complaining. They all start crying out loud and wishing they could go back to Egypt and blah, blah, blah. And that's exactly what happened. And so Moses, let's read about it in Numbers chapter 14. He says, when Moses... Basically, the Lord told Moses, like, okay, if they're going to be like that, they're going to be a bunch of belly achers. They're not going to trust me. They're not going to do that. Guess what? You don't get to go into the promised land. In fact, turn yourself around and march yourself back into the desert. That's what he told him. Let's read about it. Numbers chapter 14. When Moses reported the Lord's word to all the Israelites, the people were filled with grief. Here's what they did. They got up early the next morning and went to the top of the range of the hills. Let's go, they said. We realize that we have sinned, but now we are ready to enter the land the Lord has promised to us. In other words, God said, hey, come to the promised land. I can deliver this to you. They freaked out, said, no way. God said, well, guess what? You get to go back into the desert. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, no, wait. Let me tell you something, God. Let me tell you something. And God said, go back into the desert. Verse 41. But Moses said, why are you now disobeying the Lord's orders to return into the wilderness? It won't work. But they were determined. If you read the rest of the story, they thought they would march their little selves into the promised land, and they got their hind ends handed to them. Because you can't do it without God. You cannot accomplish what you want to accomplish, and God cannot accomplish what he wants to accomplish without you trusting him. And there's so many times when the consequences hit, we want to go, whoa, wait a minute, God. No. I trust you now. And it's too little, too late. I don't want to be on that. You know what the only thing worse than that kind of disappointment is? It's when you have disappointment and it's somebody else's fault. You ever have that? Let me give you an example. Anybody, did you have some morons in your school class growing up? And then the teacher would say, okay, that's it. She'd had it up to here. And the teacher said, that's it. No recess for everybody because Johnny can't behave. Did anybody ever have that? Let me just tell you, that led to Johnny getting beat up later in the week. That was a little playground justice for Johnny coming on Friday, buddy. You made us miss our recess. Joshua and Caleb, they were the only two people that went into this land and came back and said, we got this, people. Let's do this. And so God basically did the teacher thing. Okay, nobody gets to go in. And so Joshua and Caleb had to turn themselves around with all these other knuckleheads and march back into the desert for 40 years. Talk about disappointment. What if you were Caleb and Joshua? I would have been ticked. I'd have been so frustrated. I trusted you, God. I've been faithful. I said we could do it. Why can't we go in? After all the complaining, they had to walk back into the desert. And I love this verse in Numbers chapter 14, 22. This is Moses. These are Moses' words. How long must I put up with this wicked community and its complaints about me? He had it with these people. He's like, are you kidding me? I'm done. Moses would not see the promised land either. Even Moses was ready to be done with these bellyachers. Here was God's reply. Now go tell them this, as surely as I live. This is God telling Moses what to tell to these people. Now tell them this, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very things I heard you say. You will all drop dead in the wilderness because you complained against me, every one of you who is 20 years old and older and was included in the generation will die. You will not enter and occupy the land that I swore to give you. He goes on, the only exceptions will be Caleb, son of that guy, and Joshua, the son of Nun. God basically told Moses to tell these people, this entire generation, your entire generation, 20 years and older, you're going to march yourself back into the desert. I'm going to give you exactly what you asked for, and you're going to die, and you will not see this promised land. If I'm Caleb and Joshua, I'd have been ticked. But Caleb didn't complain about the fairness. They did not rail at God again about what they deserved. He didn't allow the disappointment to make him bitter and angry and ungrateful. The disappointment desires to defeat us. It's an emotional tool of the enemy that attempts to remove our trust in God's goodness and our hopes in his love. And I believe that Caleb and Joshua, it teaches us three important things. Courage to continue to move forward in the face of fear, to move onward despite disappointment, and to have faith that God will undoubtedly complete the work that he started in you. They had faith for that. Philippians 1:6, and I am certain that God, who began a good work within you, will continue his work until it's finally finished on the day when Jesus Christ returns. A spirit of determination not to quit. We need to learn to depend upon God. You ever notice how trials and hardship tend to turn us a little bit toward God? You ever notice that, like in your life personally? Really quickly when somebody passes or you get bad news or there's some kind of serious issue in your life, financial troubles or whatever, do you ever notice how quickly you hit your knees? And how much time you spend really in a relationship with Jesus at that point in time? It was clear that God was trying to teach the Israelites to trust him. It would take them 40 years to learn that lesson. God would essentially have to raise up a completely new generation because that generation wasn't getting it. He's like, you're just going to wander around out there and die, and then I'll use your kids to do something. And your grandkids to do something amazing. I did some math. Do you know how long it's been since Since this church started, I've said this before, this church started in a garage, but then it moved to where my school was, or is now, in town on Pine Street. And then there were a group of about 50 people that had a vision to buy 7 acres out here on this property and build the older part of the church. And it's been about 49 years since that happened. Isn't that interesting? I've been here 9 years. So when I became pastor, it had been 40 years. There had been a whole 40 years of generation of people. My question to us is, how long is it going to take us to learn to really, really trust him? I don't know, like recently, this church, and I'm grateful God has blessed us immensely, but I think sometimes that's good and bad, right? Because we really haven't had to depend upon God a whole lot. Our tithes and offering cover, what we need it to cover. He provides for us. We sit in a heated, cooled, air-conditioned building, and we have talented people and volunteers. And the thing about moving onward is that it's not going to be easy. It seems overwhelming. It seems impossible. There will be challenges, uncertainties, and I'm certain there will be disappointments. The question is, how do you respond in those moments of trouble that will determine your progress forward? And I'm talking to you individually and your family, and maybe the work that you need to do in your marriage, and maybe the work that you need to do in your career, and maybe it's what God is wanting to do in you that you have battled against and fought against and said no to forever because you just don't trust him enough to enter into the promised land. Are you going to wander around for 40 years, or are you going to lean into it? I don't want to be one of those guys that go, oh, wait, God, wait. I want to trust you now. I want to be willing to do whatever he asks me to do. As crazy as it seems, we're going to talk about that next week. Because let me tell you something. When God leads you, he will ask you to do some stupid stuff. Stuff that makes zero sense. And if you don't believe me, come back next week. We're going to talk about it. That's how he works. The question is, how will we respond in the moments of trouble? James 1, 2, and 4 says this. Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete and needing nothing. So if you're walking through it right now, if there's something going on in your life and you're walking through grief, or you're walking through financial issues, or trouble in your marriage, or trouble at school, or trouble in a relationship, count it as joy and lean into Jesus and let him lead you through it. Let him help you deal with the disappointment. He did Caleb and Joshua, and they would eventually set foot in the promised land. God would make sure. Here's the thing I will just share with you in closing. And this is the question that the older I get, like, this is a sincere question that I want to know. Like, what will here's the thing. These Israelites got sent back into the desert for 40 years. Stay with me. I'm almost done. They got sent out in the desert for 40 years. Everybody that was 20 years or older would die in the desert. But their kids were there. And their kids watched them. And their kids learned from them. What are your kids seeing in you? What are my kids seeing in me? What are my adult children? What does Tatum see in Poppy? I don't know about you, but I want this next generation to look at the people in this church, and I want my kids to look at me and go, you know what? He did everything right. He was a bit of an idiot sometimes, but he trusted God, and he believed that God could do anything. And he was willing to step into the unknown and step into the scary and step toward disappointment and step toward trouble and heartache. And he counted as pure joy. And his faith grew. That's what I see in the generation that was ahead of us. They did it. A lot of them are in this room. Not a lot of them, not anymore. Some of them are still in this room. Let me tell you this. I'll leave you with this, because I know Illinois is getting ready to start in 3 minutes and people are panicking. I'll get there, Yoshi. No, just kidding. Here's the thing I'll tell you, is sometimes we have to learn lessons in the desert. There are times in our life when you have to learn a lesson in the desert. Not on the mountaintop, but in the desert. But let me just assure you this. God's presence is constant. Exodus chapter 13:21. The Lord went ahead of them, and he guided them during the day with a pillar of cloud, and he provided a light at night with a pillar of fire. This allowed them to travel by day or by night. God's presence is constant. He will always, always provide for his people. God's discipline is redemptive. God's discipline is meant to refine us and to prepare us for something better. We should have faith over fear, and God is faithful to his promises. And eventually, these Israelites would, in fact, step foot into the promised land that he promised them 40 years prior. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 8. Look, I am giving you all this land to you. Go in and occupy it, for it is the land the Lord swore to give you, to your ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to all of their descendants. We can rely on God's faithfulness, and with God, I promise you, whether your life individually or in your relationships or in this church, we will go further, faster with him than we will without him. And I want to encourage you. So whatever you're walking through today, just lean into it. Trust him. Try not to complain too much. Ask God to help you deal with the disappointment, and ask him to teach you to be the kind of person that he wants you to be. Stand with me this morning. Father, thank you so much for your goodness to us. Lord, help us to learn a lesson that you taught the Israelites. Help us to learn a lesson so it doesn't take us quite as long, that we aren't just a bunch of complainers. We're not a bunch of bellyachers. Lord, help us to lean into you and to trust you, even in the face of some of the most difficult and overwhelming circumstances, Lord, that we can trust you in that. Help us to be Caleb and Joshua's. Help us to be the kind of people that don't just see the hurdle, but we see how you're going to help us get over that hurdle, and we're going to trust that you will help us get over the hurdle. Lord, I just pray that you would create a sense of positivity in this church and in this place. Help us to build each other up instead of tear each other down. Even in our culture, Lord, help us to love our enemies and to pray for those who would do us harm. Lord, I just pray that we would model that kind of behavior, and that you would lead us to the place that you would have for this church. Lord, we want to see what you have in store for us. I want to see what you have in store for me in my life, personally, in my marriage, and in the life of my family, and in the life of this church. Guide us, direct us, Lord. Help us to move forward in this 2025. Help us to lean into the silly things that we'll learn about next week that you may ask us to do. And Father, help us to trust that you will be there in those moments. Thank you for this church. Thank you for the faithfulness of these people. And thank you for what you're about to do in us and through us in this community and in this place. In your precious holy name I pray. Amen. Hey, thanks for being here this week. Have a great week.